So, good morning, thought leaders. It's great to be here today. Great to talk to you. Good morning. So, we want to talk about an equitable energy transition. So, we're going to answer the question, how can we, as thought leaders, as leaders within our organizations, as leaders across the industry, how can we achieve an equitable and just energy transition? Let's first start with defining it. Let's define the global transformation that is the energy transition. For the last 5 years, DNV has conducted our energy transition outlook. It's a global projection. There's no scenarios. It's our best projection at what the future will be. Fortunately for us, in the pandemic year of 2020, we actually saw a decline. But one of the predictions was we needed to see that level of decline for the next 20 years in a row. As you might imagine, 2021, we went right back onto a growth in emissions globally. So what that means is to actually limit the negative effects of climate change, the worst effects, that we in the US have to get to carbon negative by 2050, not just net zero. For the world to reach net zero, we have to get to negative. The other complications that come in are there are systemic inequities. All those other industrial revolutions built systems of inequities, racially, gender, and otherwise. So we're complicated by these compounding factors. We're behind schedule. There's more billion-dollar disasters every year based on NOAA data. So how are we going to do this? We're up against this huge challenge. A third part of that challenge is we've always tried to go with the S-curve. It was mentioned a couple times last year. Those early market adopters, we need to do some intervention to get across the chasm and then get into major market adoption. We're moving into a phase where these energy transition technologies are leaving others behind. The early adopters get all the technologies, and everyone else gets virtually none of them, but they'll be left to pay for all the stranded assets. So we have a tremendous challenge, but we're thought leaders. We got this. We're going to do it in 3 ways, and I'm going to explain each of these 3 ways. We need to be intentional, we need to be accountable, and we need to be radical or non-traditional in our thinking. So number 1, let's start off with the intentional. We need to intentionally focus on the people, not just the technologies and the systems. There was a speaker that we had that talked, not here at ECS, but at DNV, that came from a Native American reservation and specifically talked about we need to focus on people and getting them from an extractive type worldview and economy into a regenerative, circular, renewable mindset. And I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think that is the number 1 starting point. And I'll also borrow from the late, great George Carlin, the earth doesn't need saving, it's the people. The earth's going to be fine. The earth's going to be here no matter what. But it's the people that we're really trying to fight and protect. That's why we're doing all this. So what we need to do in that intentionality is to think about how does wealth actually grow and get redistributed. It's not just supplier diversity. It's not just discounts for low-income customers. It's really thinking about the entrepreneurs. How can we invest at that level to create new wealth and create new intention? Remember, the whole point is intentional. So it's not just, let's set a percent target and let's see what happens. It's let's be really intentional. How much do we want specifically from Black woman-owned businesses? How much specifically do we want to look at the workforce of the diverse-owned businesses so that we're really redistributing the wealth and changing the game? So I also want to talk about accountability. So again, I think there's regulated utilities and public power in the room. So there's always going to be those regulatory-driven goals, but at the same time, there's those investors' goals, the ESG goals. And so you've heard about the SEC climate disclosure. That's really going to hit on the E. I think we've talked a lot about the renewables and distributed generation, all those things that are going to help us on the environmental side. But let's talk about the S and the G. The G, I think, is really around the governance and thinking about what are your own diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within your own organizations. But really, where I'll focus my talk here is on the S. The S is often there's a few statements, but there's nothing specific about what are you going to do socially, how are you going to have impact on your own customers or your own service territory or your own environment. And really thinking about how can we create those accountability metrics so that you and I can hold ourselves accountable on what we're actually doing and how it has the right outcomes. And so thinking about that, there's an organization that many of you here are members of, the Equity and a Clean Energy Economy organization. So that's one of several. ACEEE also has a whole focus on equity, starting with equity, and really focusing on the metrics that'll hold each other and ourselves accountable. So I really, want to get to the third point, which I think is where we're here today for ETS, which is radical or non-traditional solutions. So what can we do that's very different than what we've been doing? So I'll give a couple of examples, and then we'll throw out a couple of other ideas that may or may not be out there so far. So number one is I'll give an example of an organization that many of you may be familiar with, called Block Power. So Block Power was founded by Donnell Baird and Keith Kinch. They're both from Harlem and Brooklyn, respectively, and they created a system to add technology and create electrification. So they're taking boilers out of old apartment buildings and old institutional buildings, electrifying those systems, and really starting from the other end of that market adoption scale. They're starting with the people that traditionally you'd think can't afford it, that are not traditionally early adopters, and centering that. But there's a few other elements that you might have missed. There's elements of crowdfunding. So using impact investment principles, and people are able to invest in these projects, whether it's the apartment building or if it's a place of worship. So really thinking about a next level of, we're always talking about how do we unlock all this private capital. Well, that's one of the ways. We're in a the internet and social media is out there. We're all connected all the time. And so the only way to capture all of the potential all the potential investment and funding and do it equitably is these new models. So another example I'll give you is Resilience Capital Partners, that's founded by Jillian Marcel, Dr. Jillian Marcel. And this organization really came up, people have heard about, the triple bottom line and things like ESG, but really a focus on the fact that you need both that blended investment. So yes, you need venture, you need private equity, you need, other forms of financing and capital. So blended financing, but also there's other forms of capital. So there's all what we can do as thought leaders, what we can do in our own organizations is accelerate and incubate those ideas. We can take a page from some other investment firms. There's Caper Capital, there's Powerhouse, where the intention is to have a large portfolio. There's no majority stakes, but they're invested in focusing on what are the minority-owned, women-owned businesses and entrepreneurs. So that's another means to really grow and redistribute that wealth. So let's also talk about a few others. I think Jason had mentioned Dr. Shelley's talk at the end of yesterday, and I want to kind of focus on that a little bit too, because we're going to hear a lot about electric vehicles, transportation electrification, but are we also talking about reducing vehicles miles traveled? We're not going to reach those goals that we said. We need radical changes to avert the worst effects of climate change and do things more equitably. So how are we reducing vehicle mile traveled in addition to electrifying those situations where we need to switch over from gasoline or diesel to electric? There's also, I think on the public power side, we can take a page from them as, SMUD, Austin, many others have had programs that work in conjunction with the city to do other things. The greatest form of carbon capture is still plants in the ocean. The natural forms of carbon capture. Again, focusing on not just the technical solutions. I love carbon capture technology. I could talk to you about it for way more than 15 minutes, but we need to think about those other forms. And who better than the utilities, the providers that are long-standing in these communities, in some cases for over 100 years, to reimagine and rethink how can we back to Dr. Shelley's talk, talking about things like redlining. There's systemic issues that need to be addressed. We can go on the other side of the tracks, which was the old form, or the other side of the red line, and think about these greening programs, urban renewal, transportation, and thinking about those things to redistribute. So we want to really think about, these are again, want to recap, we need to be very intentional, we need to be accountable, and we need to be a little more radical and non-traditional. So think about some of the other ideas and don't sort of be beholden to, okay, I can only do these things because that's what we can put into the rate base, or that's what we can put into a public good charge program. We need to think about how can we really create something more like incubators, accelerators that are going to really redistribute wealth and create the next generation of entrepreneurs. We also need to think about these new solutions that aren't just technical solutions, but combine natural solutions as well as the technical solutions, because we need to accelerate how much we're reducing carbon and how much we're treating inequities. So I'll leave you with a final thought, which is, we are here to do this. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen from okay, we have this new problem. Let's bolt on equity. Let's do this thing. Let's do this one little thing on the side, and that's going to solve the problem. It will not. You have to think about it all the time. You have to really center equity in all those decisions. So as you're going to make hundreds of decisions just in the next couple of months because of where this crowd is in terms of your positions. So think about every time you make those decisions, is there another way to do it? Is there another way to do it more equitably that's going to really go back and address some of the systemic issues that we've seen? How can we center Black women businesses? How can we center Native and Indigenous solutions that have been here for a long, long time that we might have forgotten, but are there? They might not be the solution that comes to mind first. They might not be the thing that's going to help us with the next technology, but it's going to be a blend of how can humans utilize all the technology for good and not just let's let the technology take care of it and we'll get there. We'll only end up perpetuating the same inequities if we continue to go back to that well. So again, let's all be mindful and think about being intentional, centering people. Let's be accountable. Hold yourself accountable. Hold your peers accountable. We hold each other accountable as colleagues. And then third, let's be radical and non-traditional. There's many examples out there. Maybe you know about some of those names, but you haven't gone that next layer below the surface. Be curious, explore, and question. Every time we go back to those traditional solutions, let's question it. This isn't just a least cost optimization. Least cost optimization in all of our frameworks, IRPs, rate cases, potential studies, they've got us to where we are now. So we need to think about those other dimensions if we're going to achieve equity. Thank you very much.